He lost in court, he panicked, he escalated. Donald Trump is collapsing in real time, and the collapse is turning global. After the United States Supreme Court strikes down his sweeping tariff scheme, ruling that he unlawfully abused emergency powers to tax virtually the entire planet, Trump doesn't absorb the blow. He doesn't adjust course. He lashes out. In a frantic maneuver that reeks of desperation, he seizes on Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, a rarely used provision designed for narrow currency crises, and slaps a chaotic 15% tariff on the world. Not targeted, not strategic, the world. This is not policy. This is executive panic disguised as strength. And the backlash is instantaneous and humiliating. The European Parliament is now moving to freeze ratification of its trade agreement with the United States. India is postponing a key Washington trade visit. France is summoning Trump's own ambassador, Charles Kushner, a convicted felon Trump personally pardoned over interference in French domestic politics. Greenland is openly furious after Trump posts bizarre promises about sending hospital ships to save them, ships reportedly sitting in maintenance thousands of miles away. Meanwhile, a U.S. nuclear submarine surfaces off Greenland's coast during a Danish royal visit, igniting fears of a grotesque geopolitical stunt. Allies are recoiling, markets are bracing, and American credibility is bleeding out in public. Instead of admitting defeat, Trump's inner circle is fanning out across Sunday shows, insisting nothing has changed. His Treasury Secretary is dodging whether Americans will be refunded the $134 billion vacuumed up through these now illegal tariffs. $134 billion taken while they gaslight the public in broad daylight. And then comes the humiliation cherry on top. A man calling himself John Barron phones into C-SPAN to rage about the Supreme Court's decision, the same alias Trump notoriously used for decades to pose as his own spokesperson. You are not watching strategy. You are watching a regime unravel. And when power starts unraveling like this, the next move is rarely stable and rarely sane. Now let's talk about the lie. Because before this meltdown, before the scrambling, before the Section 122 stunt, Donald Trump and his cabal were swearing up and down that everything was legal, everything was strategic, everything was under control. They told you the tariffs were airtight, they told you the emergency powers were justified, they told you this was about protecting American industry, they told you the courts would never interfere. And then the Supreme Court stepped in and said, no. So what happens next? Do they admit they overreached? Do they level with the American people? Of course not. They gaslight harder. Let's look at what they're saying now. Trump's trade representative, Jameson Greer, goes on national television and is confronted with a simple reality. 2/3 of Americans oppose these tariffs. The Supreme Court has already rejected the prior legal theory. So why is the administration now pivoting to a different statute to impose essentially the same tariffs? Greer's response is stunning in its brazenness. He says the policy hasn't changed, only the legal tool has changed. Read that again. The policy hasn't changed, only the legal tool. That's an incriminating admission, because what he is effectively saying is, we will keep doing the same thing, and if one legal theory collapses, we'll just shop around for another one. If AIPA fails, we move to Section 122. If that fails, we move to Section 301. If that fails, maybe Section 232. It's not law-driven governance, it's outcome-driven power grabbing. That's magical thinking masquerading as executive authority. And then comes the refund question, the one they do not want to answer. On CNN, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is asked the most basic question imaginable. Will Americans be refunded the approximately $134 billion collected under tariffs that the Supreme Court has now deemed unlawfully imposed? It's not a trick question. It's not partisan. It's about your money. Bessent doesn't say yes. He doesn't say no. He says the question is bad framing. Bad framing. He insists the Supreme Court ruling was narrow. He insists it didn't address refunds. He insists it's up to lower courts. He repeatedly refuses to commit to giving Americans their money back. Let's be clear about what's happening here. The administration imposed tariffs under emergency powers. Those tariffs were struck down. American companies paid billions. Those costs were passed on to consumers. And now, instead of saying, of course we'll refund unlawfully collected funds, they're hiding behind procedural fog. That's not strength. That's evasion. And while this is unfolding, something else surfaces that perfectly captures the psychological state of this movement. A man calling himself John Barron phones into C-SPAN to rage about the Supreme Court's decision. Longtime observers know the name. John Barron is the alias Donald Trump notoriously used for decades to pose as his own public relations spokesperson, calling reporters, planting stories, hyping himself up. So right after the Supreme Court humiliates him, a John Barron calls in to complain about the ruling. You can't script this. Whether it was him or a devoted imitator almost doesn't matter. The symbolism is devastating. Instead of confronting legal reality, this movement retreats into performance, grievance, and fantasy. And then there's Charles Kushner, the ambassador to France who is now being summoned by French authorities over interference in domestic politics. This is the same Charles Kushner who pleaded guilty to tax evasion and witness tampering. The same Kushner who hired a prostitute to entrap his own brother-in-law in a blackmail scheme. The same Kushner who was pardoned by Donald Trump. This is who represents the United States abroad right now. So when Greer claims no countries have said they will withdraw from tariff deals, it collapses under scrutiny. The European Parliament is freezing ratification. India is delaying meetings. The so-called deals are often nothing more than fluctuating tariff announcements on social media. The receipts are everywhere. They said it was legal. The court said no. They said it was popular. The polls say no. They said it was strategic. The world is freezing cooperation. They said nothing has changed. Everything is changing. This isn't confidence. This is a power structure improvising under pressure, hoping speed and volume can outrun accountability. And that strategy rarely ends well. Now let's slow this down and actually examine what they're doing, because the details here matter. This isn't just bluster. This isn't just political theater. This is a pattern of executive overreach wrapped in legal gymnastics. Start with the Supreme Court decision. The administration originally invoked emergency powers under IEEPA, claiming there was some kind of economic emergency justifying sweeping tariffs on countries across the globe. That theory collapsed. The Supreme Court rejected it. The court essentially said, you don't get to manufacture an emergency to rewrite global trade policy by executive decree. That's not subtle. That's a rebuke. So what does Trump do next? He pivots to Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Now here's where it gets interesting. Section 122 was designed for narrow, short-term balance of payments crises. It was meant for situations involving serious international monetary instability, not as a blanket authority to slap a universal 15% tariff on allies, adversaries, and neutral trading partners alike. I want you to understand how dramatic this pivot is. He loses on one legal theory. Within days, he reaches for another statute, one rarely used in modern trade disputes, and deploys it as a workaround. That's not continuity. That's legal improvisation. And when Jameson Greer goes on television and says, the policy hasn't changed, the legal tool has, that's the tell. That's the admission, because it confirms this was never about lawful authority. It was about achieving the outcome first and reverse engineering the legal justification later. Now let's examine the economic consequences that they're desperately trying to obscure. Approximately $134 billion was collected under the now-invalidated tariffs. That's not abstract. That's real money extracted from importers, passed along supply chains, and ultimately absorbed by American consumers. I want to be precise here. American companies paid those tariffs at the border. They didn't eat the cost out of charity. They raised prices. Consumers paid more for goods. Businesses recalibrated supply chains. Markets adjusted. And now that the legal foundation is cracked, the administration is dodging the refund question like it's radioactive. Let's look closely at Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's response. When asked whether the government would refund the $134 billion collected, he says the Supreme Court ruling was narrow. He says the court remanded it down. He insists it's not up to me. Notice what's missing. There is no statement that the administration intends to return unlawfully collected funds. There is no commitment to protect taxpayers. There is no urgency. If this were reversed, if a Democratic administration had unlawfully imposed $134 billion in tariffs, do you think the outrage on the right would be muted? Of course not. It would be apocalyptic. Now layer in the international reaction. The European Parliament announcing a freeze on ratification of the EU-US trade agreement is not symbolic. Ratification processes are sensitive diplomatic undertakings. Freezing one signals a loss of confidence. India postponing a Washington trade visit signals instability. Countries don't delay high-level trade meetings lightly. They do it when the ground is shifting. France summoning Charles Kushner over interference in domestic politics is not routine diplomacy. It is a warning shot. And then we have Greenland. Trump posts messages claiming he is sending hospital ships, the USNS Mercy and the USNS Comfort, to save Greenlanders. Except reports indicate those ships are undergoing long-term maintenance. Greenland officials push back, noting they already have universal health care and did not request intervention. Then a U.S. nuclear submarine surfaces off Greenland's coast during a visit by Denmark's King Frederick X. Let's pause there. A nuclear submarine surfaces near Greenland during a royal visit, and shortly thereafter, Trump is posting about sending hospital ships to save the territory, which he has previously floated acquiring. If you're Greenland, that doesn't feel humanitarian. That feels like a pressure tactic, a grotesque display of hard power wrapped in benevolent rhetoric. You cannot blame Greenlandic officials for being alarmed. Now step back and look at the pattern. Legal authority collapses. Executive pivots to obscure statute. International allies question stability. Administration insists nothing has changed. Refunds for $134 billion raised. Treasury dodges. Diplomatic friction escalates. Surrogate claims no countries are withdrawing. Embarrassing alias resurfaces on C-SPAN. Movement retreats into grievance theatrics. This is not coherent governance. This is reactive governance. And when regimes start governing reactively, when they are constantly plugging holes, spinning narratives, searching for new levers of power, it reveals something deeper. It reveals fear. Because confident administrations don't need to rotate legal authorities like interchangeable batteries. They don't need to dodge refund questions. They don't need fake spokesperson personas calling into television networks to vent. They operate with stability, predictability, lawful authority. What we are watching instead is a leadership structure that is constantly escalating to avoid acknowledging error. And historically, when leaders respond to legal defeat with escalation rather than recalibration, the consequences compound. This is not just about tariffs. It's about whether executive power has limits, or whether the strategy now is to test every possible statute until one sticks. And that is where this story becomes far bigger than a trade dispute. Now let's zoom out. Because if this were just about tariffs, it would already be serious. But it's not just about tariffs. It's about a pattern. A psychological pattern, a governance pattern, a collapse pattern. Look at the behavior. When confronted with legal defeat, Trump doesn't recalibrate. He escalates. When challenged on facts, he doesn't clarify. He rants. When faced with international pushback, he doesn't negotiate. He threatens, posts, improvises. We've seen this before. Think about the business record. Trump casinos, bankrupt. Trump steaks, vanished. Trump University, fraudulent and shut down. The Atlantic City Empire, collapsed under debt and mismanagement. Each time the pattern was the same. Overpromise, overleverage, deny reality, escalate rhetoric. And now that same pattern is playing out at the level of national power. The Supreme Court says your tariff theory is unlawful. Instead of recalculating, you reach for another statute. The world signals discomfort. Instead of stabilizing markets, you double down on bravado. Allies express concern. You call it strength. That's not strategy. That's a man who has never internalized limits. And then there's the psychological component. You see it in the rallies, the rambling tangents, the verbal stumbles, the constant grievance loops. You see it in the interviews, the inability to answer direct questions without pivoting into conspiracy or self-praise. You see it in the fixation on perceived enemies, judges, journalists, foreign leaders, even entire countries. When power starts reacting emotionally instead of structurally, institutions strain. Look at the ICE narrative that's unfolding simultaneously. J.D. Vance goes on television claiming that the administration's immigration enforcement push is focused on violent sex offenders. That sounds surgical. That sounds targeted. But the data tells a different story. Sex offenders reportedly account for a tiny fraction of ICE arrests, roughly around 1%. Previous administrations, including Obama and Biden, deported higher numbers of individuals with serious criminal records, without turning enforcement into a theatrical show of masked agents and paramilitary optics. Yet this administration is leaning into imagery that feels designed for intimidation rather than precision. And when Democrats request basic guardrails, body cameras, judicial warrants, removing masks, staying away from polling places during midterms, the response isn't negotiation. It's brinkmanship, government shutdown threats, escalation. Even the TSA pre-check episode tells a story. The Department of Homeland Security reportedly floats suspending TSA PreCheck and global entry amid the shutdown dispute. Public outrage surges. Within hours, the administration backtracks. That is reactive governance. Float a drastic move, gauge reaction, retreat if backlash spikes. That's not steady leadership. That's a feedback loop driven by outrage metrics. Now combine all of this with the international instability triggered by the tariff maneuver. Allies freezing agreements, trade visits delayed, diplomatic summons issued, Greenland publicly alarmed, a nuclear submarine surfacing at a moment of heightened sensitivity. And remember, this is happening while midterms loom on the horizon. Polls show broad public discomfort with tariffs. Markets are watching for volatility. Businesses crave predictability. And instead of stability, they're getting legal experimentation layered on top of executive improvisation. Historically, administrations that enter midterm cycles with economic uncertainty, international friction, and visible internal chaos do not perform well. That's not partisan, that's political gravity. So what does this look like when you connect the dots? A leader facing legal limits, a legal team scrambling for alternate authorities, an economic policy rejected by courts but repackaged under new statutes, international allies signaling distrust, domestic enforcement agencies escalating theatrics, poll numbers showing discomfort, rapid backtracks when backlash spikes. That is not the profile of an administration expanding from strength. That is the profile of one defending ground. And when leaders start defending ground rather than advancing coherent policy, the tone shifts, the rhetoric sharpens, the us versus them framing intensifies. Blame migrates outward, to courts, to foreign nations, to left-wing extremism, to the press. We've seen this pattern globally. Governments under pressure either stabilize and recalibrate, or they escalate and polarize. Right now, every move in this tariff saga, every Sunday show dodge, every diplomatic flare-up suggests escalation. And escalation, when paired with legal vulnerability and economic uncertainty, rarely signals renewal. It signals the late stages of overreach. This is the difference between strength and spectacle, between law and improvisation, between leadership and ego. A lawful administration respects court rulings. It adjusts policy within constitutional limits. It protects taxpayers when money has been wrongly collected. It reassures allies when stability is shaken. What we are watching instead is something far more dangerous. We are watching executive power being stretched, tested, and rotated through obscure statutes in real time. We are watching $134 billion hang in limbo while officials dodge refund questions. We are watching allies freeze agreements and summon ambassadors. We are watching escalation layered on top of escalation, all while being told nothing has changed. Everything has changed. This is not about left versus right. It is about whether the rule of law still constrains power. It is about whether economic policy is grounded in statute or in impulse. It is about whether democratic institutions hold when pressure rises. History is clear. When leaders treat legal defeat as a trigger for escalation rather than accountability, the damage compounds. The only antidote to that pattern is sunlight, scrutiny, and civic engagement. If you value independent analysis that cuts through the noise and follows the receipts, hit subscribe. Let's push this channel to the next milestone together. Support independent media. Stay informed, stay engaged, because democracy does not defend itself. People do.